Hello, students of AP Human Geography. This is Mr. Sheridan, and we are here to discuss Chapter 11, Key Issues 1 and 4 today. This involves industry, and the two key issues are going to be where is industry distributed and why are industries changing location. So, a couple things to note. First of all, industry is defined as manufacturing of goods in a factory or adding value to a product or service. So, you're taking raw materials primarily from the primary sector, right? And you are bringing them to a factory or maybe a home. That would be called cottage industry. And you are changing that. You are adding value to it. So, what comes into the factory is worth less than what comes out. That value has been added in terms of a finished product. Right. You should note that industry is much more clustered than agriculture. Agriculture is universal throughout places where there is arable land. There is agriculture, so you are going to see that across time and space. Commercial or subsistence agriculture, all of that. Industry, on the other hand, is way more clustered, right? But it is trending in terms of moving from MDCs to LDCs. We call this deindustrialization in the United States. And as you can see from our slide here, that the United States did lose a third of its manufacturing in a 10-year period in the early 2000s. All right, that leads us to a couple of things that we're looking at that are green slides that aren't in the book. Those are things called commodification is the first one, and then we'll talk about the life cycle of a product. So commodification is the process through which something is given monetary value. Things that weren't valued as being worth anything all of a sudden are. Good example of that is bottled water. Right in the 80s, bottled water was this kind of a joke. It was like, why would you bother getting bottled water when you have a tap, right, or a drinking fountain? Why would you pay for that when it's free? And that has changed, right? It has become commodified through marketing, right, and through other things like that. We look at mobile tablets, right? We look at the price cycle of these things. Prices are high to begin with, right? Very, very high. They go down as improvements happen and brands come on the market. Right, video game consoles are a good example of that as well. Anytime a brand new video game console comes out, like a PS5 or a PS7 or something along those lines, I know there's not a seven, but at this point, but when that first comes out, they're very, very expensive, and then within 2 years, they've dropped a couple $100s, and they become as they become more accessible. All right, product cycle, life cycle is goes in four stages: introduction, growth, maturation, and decline. Right. So good examples of each phase of the production life cycle is in introduction. Right now, we have holographic projection devices. Right. Um, Growth market would be tablets. Right. A mature market would be things like laptops, been around. Right. And then a declining market would be something like typewriters, which are obsolete at this point. Right. So here is a good example or a good graph that shows our deindustrialization when we look at the percentage of manufacturing jobs in the United States. It was at a peak at around 40% and has declined to less than 10%. It comes to jobs, right? And we do see that this is not evenly distributed. You see loss of employment hitting the Rust Belt very hard. We'll talk about shifting manufacturing within the United States as well as this PowerPoint moves on. Right, so there's your Rust Belt, right, around the Great Lakes, and we look at Detroit being a good poster child for that as well, as we see automobile industries moving and shifting from the north to the south. Right. When it comes to the origin of industry, modern manufacturing is going to start in England, in Britain, in the late 1700s. Channel your chapter 2, demographic transition model, stage 2, that type of thing. We see new inventions, higher productivity, higher standards of living. We also see a lot of change happening, right? There's a middle class that emerges. There's different social and political thoughts. We see, capitalism and socialism starting to move when we were previously in kind of monarchy situations, right? So there's a lot of social upheaval. We see a lot of new inventions that drive up productivity, right? The good example of that one is going to be Watt's steam engine, which is going to increase transportation of products from one place to another. We also see England being very rich in two major resources, and that is coal, right, and iron ore, which both of which are needed for steel. You need to heat up the iron ore using coal, which burns hotter and longer than other energy sources, and that's how you get steel to come about. We also see then advances in transportation, like steamships and locomotives, right, and then mechanization as well, right, which is going to really boost productivity when you have machines doing more of the work, right, and it's going to drive down the cost of doing things, labor costs, right? Textile mills are going to be a great example of that. Here's a good picture of that. Note that there's a lot of female employees here. Who are very exploited, right? And that will you will see this in 2021 in textile mills as well, right? We do see a diffusion again, looking at England being the hub, the hearth, right, and then seeing it spread out through the rest of Europe as well, right? In terms of using railways as a good example, because it's going to include a lot of steel, it's going to involve a steam engine, it's going to involve a lot of different things, so transportation as well. All right, so our first two of the world's industrial regions, classic industrial regions, are Europe and North America. Again, Europe, talk about the United Kingdom being the first to industrialize. Talk about steel and textiles being pretty important coming out of there. You also see other spots there on this PowerPoint. Notice that there's going to be a connection between access to the ocean for trade, right, and then proximity to natural resources like coal, right? Those are going to be important factors, right? North America, again, when you think of early industry, think of the Northeast United States, right? That East Coast, right? The Mid-Atlantic area, the Rust Belt as well. And all of these are going to be access to transportation and large markets, right? You're going to have access to the ocean. The Great Lakes provide access to the ocean, right? And then the other one we look at is Southern California, which has cheap labor, right? It's proximity to Mexico, its proximity to food, right? There's a lot of canning because of the Central Valley and all of the fruits and vegetables that are grown there, right? And then any clothing that is manufactured in the United States tends to come out of there as well, in correlation to cheap labor. All right, major industrial regions. Again, we look at the first two on a world map. You see the United States and you see Europe here, right? And we'll talk about East Asia in a second, right? Here is the industrial centers of Europe, right? Again, note the correlation to access to waterways, right? And the ocean for transportation, right? And we could look at the same way as well in the United States here, right? So there's Southern California, you see your Great Lakes and your Rust Belt area, and then you have the Northeast, right? New England and the Mid-Atlantic. Our third and equally important industrial region, traditional industrial region, is going to be East Asia, right? Where the most abundant resource is going to be people, right? The ability to harness the abundant unskilled labor in China is very, very important, right? Japan and China are very different markets. They produce very different things. So note the difference between Japan. Japan is known for its skilled labor, right? Think of its strong education system, and then its quality products, right? So cars, electronics, right? And you'll see that when you think about your big Japanese companies, right? Honda, Toyota, Sony, Nintendo, Mitsubishi. Those are all Japanese countries, right? Or companies, sorry, known for high quality electronics and automobiles, right? China, on the other hand, has a huge labor market, right? And a labor pool to go with it. So you're going to see a different type of product, right? Chinese steel is very important, as a natural resource, right? Iron ore and coal is abundant there. But consumer goods and textiles, right? And they're going to be a lot cheaper, right? A lot of unskilled labor. So note the difference between skilled and unskilled between Japan and China, right? And then just the sheer number of people in China are going to drive down wages, right? They're going to be very low because there's so many people. There's a flood of people looking for employment. Right. This leads us to site factors. Site factors are going to be unique characteristics of a specific location. We have three that the book talks about, and then a fourth one being energy. Labor, capital, and land are going to be pretty important. Labor being the most important, and then the fourth one that isn't mentioned in the book is energy, right? And that's access to cheap energy. We don't see a lot of that. We'll mention that just a little bit as we move on. Right. So the most important one is labor. Labor is the ability of a place to have cheap labor, right? And that's going to be think India and China, right? And the large variation in wages. Paying in American wages to work American hours, right? And with American benefits is very, very different than Chinese hours, Chinese wages, and Chinese benefits. Right, Chinese workers do not enjoy a minimum wage. They don't enjoy a 40-hour work week. They don't enjoy a safe work environment. Right, all of these protections that American workers have don't exist overseas. And when you have a large amount of unskilled labor, you're not going to make a whole lot of money. Right, which leads us to labor-intensive industries. And labor-intensive industries are industries where most of what it costs you to put a product on the market is paying people to do the work. Right. The best example of that is textiles. Right. The amount of money that you have to pay workers to make the textiles far exceeds the amount of money you have to pay for the thread, the buttons, and the cloth. Right. And anything else that goes into the products. Right. So labor intensive industries are industries where wages make up a high percentage of the production cost. All right. When we look at labor intensive industries, we look at we look down at India and China, right, and how much money they're making an hour compared to what you would be making in the United States. All right. Our second piece that we're looking at is capital, and that is the ability to get a loan or get a tax break or something along those lines. Um, access to loans and financing is going to be pretty important, or getting a tax break, or getting a place that your factory is to build a road or to upgrade the infrastructure around your place. All of those things go into those might not be wages, but they are a capital, right? And so LDCs sometimes lose out to industrial locations because they don't have the financing, they don't have the banks and all of that, their ability to get loans, right? um, the ability to get a loan, it affects places like Silicon Valley, right? Silicon Valley banks were traditionally willing to lend to startup companies, which is a risky investment where other places weren't, right? And so that's how Silicon Valley became this agglomeration for the tech industry. So how does an LDC attract industry? They do things like offer huge tax breaks, and we'll talk about that when we talk about special economic zones. Um, they can offer to build roads or other infrastructure projects to help attract a factory, right? And so you do get a bit of a bidding war sometimes. Like countries will try to offer a really nice, sweet, incentivized package for a company to build their factory in the country. All right, so that leads us to SEZs, right, which are special economic zones. These are areas that are set aside to attract industry, where you get special tax incentives. The design is the purpose of it is to try to attract foreign investment, right, foreign businesses, right. And so what this really does, and you will see them located near big cities in China, but not in the big cities. But they do really, really change the landscape, right? That you see a huge amount of migration happening. So population is going to increase in that area. You're going to see squatter settlements. You're going to see housing being a commodity in places like Binhai or Pudong or Shenzhen. And so these are massively transformative in if a SEZ comes to near your place, right? Notice that they're located next to or near the coast, right, for transportation. They're also maybe located next to big cities. All right, EPZs are essentially the same thing, just a different way of saying it. Sometimes they're called EPZs, exporting processing zones, EPZs. Um, or they're also called SECs. They're essentially the same thing. All right, our third site factor that we're looking at is land, right? And land matters as well, the ability to get cheap land, right? So let's talk a little bit about history. And early factories were located where their customers and where the labor pool was, because we didn't have massive transportation, right? The world was a lot more spread out and a lot further away, and so you needed to put your factories in downtowns, right? And downtowns are not great locations for industry because they don't have a lot of space, right? Remember that the land is used very intensively, right? Um, and so they tended to be multi-story buildings, right? Which cuts down on efficiency if you have to break your assembly line into multiple floors, right? But they were located there in city centers because you had access to your customers, you had access to a labor pool, and you were near a railroad line for transporting your goods. A great example of that is downtown Minneapolis, right? Where Minneapolis is known as the Mill City, because wheat would come down the river and it would stop in Minneapolis, and we had these milling factories in downtown. The Stone Arch Bridge was at one point a rail line, right? That was used to connect Minneapolis to other railway lines, and so the wheat would stop. It would get turned into flour, right? It would get milled into flour, and then it would move along its way either down the Mississippi in a barge or on a railroad line. Right, and so you see that in the warehouse district today. You have the Mill City Museum. You have all of this cool history that goes with industry in downtown Minneapolis. Right, modern factories are going to look very different. They are not going to be located in downtowns. It's not efficient. There is access to transportation for both customers and for your labor pool, so you don't have to be in downtown. So you're going to use a one-story building that's going to be in the suburbs or rural areas because land is cheaper, right? Way cheaper than downtown. They're generally going to be located near major highway junctions, right? And you can locate it maybe near an energy source at some level, which is another site factor as well. But a good example of that is the Wakota Bridge, right? And when my children were younger and we would be traveling across the Wakota Bridge, we called it the Stinky Bridge because it would stink, right? Sometimes it would smell really bad, and you've all been on that. And you've all smelled that nasty smell, and that is industry that is located, right, in a suburban place, right, in a large one-story building, right, because of cheap land, and is located near major highway junctions. So you have a perfect example of a modern factory site factor right there in our near our own backyards. Right, so there's the St. Paul Casket Company. Notice it's multi-story and where it was, and they used to make and located near a rail line. This is a good example of an early factory, right, in St. Paul. Here's a modern factory. Here's a Saturn factory. It's probably closed at this point because they don't make Saturns anymore. But in Tennessee, right? Notice it's one story. Notice it's located near highways. Notice it is nowhere near a downtown area. All right. Our fourth site factor is energy, right? So think back in history, you needed to be near water, perhaps for a hydroelectric, something along those lines. But today, we don't think of energy as a site factor, right? Transportation costs have been much, much lowered. We'll talk about containerization as we move through here too. And we look at cheap foreign oil, right, being a very big piece as well. Now, that changed a little in the 1970s, but we are importing a lot of oil now. We are also starting to use our own oil. And so, comparatively, we don't pay a lot of money for petroleum in the United States, and so transportation and energy being used in that isn't necessarily as big a role in determining your industrial location as land, labor, or capital. All right, and that leads us then to our next thing, which is situation. Right, and we're going to learn about Weber's least cost theory here. Right, situation factors that are involving transportation, what you're near, right, why you would put a factory near something. Right, and the two things you're going to think about here is the cost of importing raw materials and the cost of transporting the raw materials. So how much does it cost to bring the stuff you're going to make your product out of to your factory, and how much does it cost to bring your finished product to the market so it can be sold? So when we look at proximity to inputs or raw materials, right, we start talking about bulk reducing industries, right, and these are industries that what you make, your finished product or your output, right, is cheaper to transport or lighter. Right, it's been reduced in bulk to transport than the raw materials. So big things come into a factory, right? Heavy things come into a factory, and lighter things come out of a factory. And if that is the case, if that's what you're making, whatever you make, right, like copper or steel are great examples of that. Um, you want to put locate your factory near the raw materials because they're much heavier to uh, to transport and they cost more to transport. So you're going to want to transport that the least amount of distance. Right, and you want to transport the smaller stuff, whatever you're turning it into, right, into the longest because it's going to be cheaper to transport that way. All right, so a good example of that right there, right? Again, we head back to the Wakota Bridge and we look at West St. Paul, South St. Paul in there. We see this factor here. I don't know if any of you thought that that was a water slide right over here when you were young growing up, but there's been a number of my students who have like, yeah, I used to think that was a water slide, and then when they found out, they were kind of disappointed, right? But what goes in to this factory is this big inputs, right? And what comes out is rebar, right? Which is steel that is put into concrete to reinforce the concrete. So think about those things when you think about uh, what we used to put in parking lots, right? To 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 designate which parking spots are what, right? I don't know if rebar still exists in many spots, but maybe that's not a great example because we don't see those a lot these days. I think my age just showed. Um, so we look at steel locations, and they're going to be located near the inputs, not near where it's sold, but near where the raw materials are. And the two biggest things that go into steel are going to be coal, right, to heat the coal. That doesn't come out, right? That just gets burned up. And then the iron ore, right, which comes in big, bulky rocks, right, and needs to be broken down and turned into something much smaller, right? So we see where these the late 1800s, mid 1800s, we see a shifting there, right, from the Iron Range where that's input, and then we see where coal country is over in here, right? And you're going to put your steel factories there. Right? You're not going to put them in Texas, even though you might be using the steel in Texas. You're going to haul the finished steel to Texas because it's much cheaper to do that than it is to haul all the coal and all the iron ore down there, right, to make the steel. All right, so the opposite of that is going to be putting things together to make big things, right? That your inputs come out, small inputs come in, and what comes out is bigger. And that's called a bulk gaining industry, right? Where the finished product or the output or whatever product you're making, right, is more expensive to transport than the raw materials. It's bigger. It is gained bulk in the industrialization process, right? And if you're going to do that, you want to put it near the customers. You don't want to be hauling these heavy things around, so you're going to want to assemble it, right, very near your customers. Good example of that is cars. Cars are made of many parts, right, and they are put together near the market, right? And the United States is a really big market, so you see a lot of car manufacturing in the United States. Beverages is a good example too. Why would you haul a heavy beverage around, right, when you can make the beverage, which is going to be something like beer or soda, right? Which when you put things together, they get heavier. That's going to you want to put that nearest the market, right? Machinery is a good example too, right? You put a bunch of parts together and you come out with a machine. right? So we do see that the ingredients in beer, right? All of that, which is the heaviest is going to be water, right? And so you're going to put all of that stuff together, and it's going to be heavier when it's done, right? When you put things together, it's invariably going to take on more mass, right? You're going to put that near the customers. Right, so when we start talking about beer and pop production, right, notice that these are Anheuser-Busch and Miller and Coors, right? So big brewing manufacturers don't brew just in one spot. They brew all over, right? So the Coors that is sold in Minnesota is probably made in Wisconsin here, right? In this piece right there in that factory. It's not made in Colorado, which is the home of Coors Brewing, right? It's not made there, right? It is made here, right? And so you notice that they put them all over the place, and that's to make it near the customer, right? Because it is a bulk gaining industry. Same with the assembly plants. Again, you're going to notice that those have happened. Those are moving. They're shifting. Right, new plants right are shifting down south. We'll talk a little bit about that when it comes to labor costs as well. All right, Coke bottling plants. Again, you're going to see. Look at how many Coke bottling plants there are just in the South. Right, you're going to see all of those. The franchise territories are going to be in different spots, and your bottling plants are you don't want to haul Coke very far, right? Because it's heavy, right? So you're going to want to manufacture it near your markets. All right, other things we can look at here is Hotelling's model. Right, it's another way to look at things, and this works well if you think about the location of industries, and you think about it as a straight line. And if you ever wonder why um, locations, sometimes you will see like two gas stations that are across the street from each other or within a block from each other. Right, and if you think about the market area being this line, right? And if we think about a beach, this is our classic example here. We think about a beach, um, and we have a stand right here, right? In part A, right? B is the middle, and we see a second ice cream stand here, right? In order to this would be an equal market share that C would get pretty much all the way up to B, and A would get all the way up to B on this other side. But if A moves closer to B, right, it's going to take up just a little bit more. It's going to get all of what they had before, right? And so it's going to snake a little bit towards B to try to capture some of the market share that C previously had. C is going to be no dummy, and they're going to move closer to there. And pretty soon you're going to have two ice cream stands that are going to be on just right on either side of B. Even though it's not as convenient for everybody, it's to try to maximize the amount of profit, right? So vendors would locate next to each other in the middle of a market area to maximize the profit, right? So that is Hotelling's model, and a beach is a good example of that, right? Or a one street town. All right. Other things to look at is Losch's model, right? As firms identify profitability, not just to a point where income will produce costs. So we look at the zone of profitability, right? We look at price here, and we look at space, right? A zone of profitability, right? Not just a point, right? Where they're not saying this is the ideal point. They're going to look at a zone more than that, right? As opposed to income and cost. Right, Ullman's conceptual frame is another thing that when we think about where industry is located and what you're going to do, making there, and so trade, and it talks about trade interactions between places, right? And it talks about three phenomena, right? Complementary, intervening opportunity, and transferability. Right, so complementary are when two regions through trade can specifically satisfy each other's demands. Right, so if America sells cars to one place in exchange for bananas, because we don't grow bananas very well here, that would be a complementary regional situation, right? Any intervening opportunity might pop up though, right? Whereas if a place that is closer to where we were previously buying our bananas came into play, that we might change, right? We might go to a different place that might be more an attractive place because it's closer, right, than sites further away, right? And then transferability is the ease in which goods may be transported from one area to another, right? Or difficulty. So you do have to take in consideration some physical geography, right? If there's mountains or if there's oceans or there's distance or things like that. All right. So speaking of distance, talk a little bit about friction of distance and how that relates to industry. Right. The industry, we start talking about time and cost, right? And that usually involves distance, right? So when we think about distance decay, right, you're less likely to interact with places. You're less likely to go to a place unless you're commuting, right? The further away you are from that spot, and so that's going to play into industry as well. You might buy from some place that is closer, right? So that goes into Ullman's place as well. All right, other things to think about: specialized industries, right? That should be near markets, right? So we talk about two different things: perishable goods, right? Things like newspapers and bread, right? Bakeries, newspapers are going to be good examples of that because of spoilage. So go back to your agriculture, right, and think of your ability to get something to market fast before it spoils. And then single market manufacturers are another thing to think about, right? And these are specialized industries that only have one or two major customers. The best example of that is car parts, right? Car parts generally don't sell to the general public. People don't go out and buy a brand new horn, right? If you're selling horns, you're probably selling them to an automobile maker, not, and maybe a few to car parts stores like Napa or AutoZone or something like that, right? And so with this, when you have a specialized industry, you need to, and single market manufacturers, you're generally going to locate near where that industry is. Right, when you have one or two major customers, and so that also allows something called just-in-time delivery. And just-in-time delivery is this interesting little phenomenon that exists really within car parts and car manufacturing. So you'll see car part factories that are going to exist near where the cars are being made, right? And a car maker will call up a car part factory and say, "Hey, we need 2,000 car horns here in a day, right? Or in a matter of hours." Right, and it is the car part manufacturer's job to get that there. You can't do that if your factory's in China, right? And your customer is in America. So you need to locate very very close to that. Why they do that? It reduces inventory. And you don't have to worry about stocking parts. If you are a car manufacturer, you can just order it and it shows up, and then it puts the cost of warehousing all of these onto the car parts maker as well. So it's a cost saving measurement for the automobile industry. All right. So we look at auto locations, right? We look at transmission and assemblies, right? And this is just Honda plants as well, right? So we look at vehicle assembly, but we also look at engine and transmission assemblies being very close, right? So they're moving from part to part or place to place. All right, speaking of transportation, right, we talk about four different types here. We got trucks, trains, ships, and airplanes. They all have advantages and disadvantages. Trucks, for example, are going to be the best for short distance delivery, right? Think about your Amazon truck, right, that drives around your neighborhood and drops things off. That wouldn't be as efficient if it were a train or a ship or an airplane. Although we are going to get, right, at some point we're going to get uh, those little things that I'm thinking of. Oh, the things that you fly remotely, right? They're gonna drop off goods. I am absolutely losing that word. Right. Anyway, trains, all right, are best for long distance via land. Right. They're much more efficient. Right. You don't have traffic delays. You don't have people who need rest. Right. Truckers need to rest. There are laws against truckers driving X amount of hours. Right. So that's going to be more efficient. Right. As well. Ship is the best for long distances if you're not in a hurry, right? And we'll talk about containerization. You're going to watch a video on containerization that is absolutely fantastic, right? But it talks about how cheap, right, a cargo ship is, right, and how efficient it is, and how containerization has really driven down transportation costs, right? But it is the cheapest per dollar per mile. right? And then the most expensive one is going to be airplanes, right? And it's best for quick delivery, right? Next day, stuff like that, over a long distance of time. But it is also the most expensive, right? Oftentimes, multiple methods are used, right? So when a transportation system shifts, right, we have something called break a bulk point, right? You're going to see that, like for example, at an airport, or you're going to see that ports are good break a bulk points, right, where a ship comes in and the products get hauled away on trains or trucks, right? And then again, we get to containerization, right? Allows for a very quick transfer of goods. You don't have to put everything on uh, or off, take it off the ship one piece at a time. You have to take it off one container at a time, and so it is massively more efficient, more productive to do it that way. All right, so there you see the transportation. These are the containers, right? This is the port of Long Beach, right? So all of the things coming from Asian markets come in to here or other parts on the West Coast, right? So you have that piece happening right there, and then they get loaded off of these cranes. They get pulled off of the ship by a crane, and they get loaded either onto railroad cars or onto semi trucks, right? And they don't need to be unpacked, right? It is an amazing piece of innovation here, right? So we look at trains. Note there's the containers right there on the trains, and then our train system, which is vast throughout the United States, right? We see semi trucks in terms of major highways and volume. Again, we're looking at a container right in here, right? And then we look at shipping routes, and again, we see the container, the amazing container. Right, so those are pretty interesting. Right, last couple things we're going to talk about: commodity chain. Right, series of links that connect places of production and distribution, resulting in a commodity or product that is exchanged on a world level. Right, so it's the end product is what we're used to seeing, but it's all of the different places, right, and things and people that create that thing, right, from the extracting the raw material all the way through buying the thing off the shelf, right, at the Apple store, right? You're going to see again an increase in wealth as it goes up to the finished product. So the people who are working in the mines pulling the rare earth elements out that are going to make your iPhone, they don't that stuff isn't worth as much money as the iPhone itself. All right. And we do tend to go back into the world systems theory here. We talk about the periphery and the core, right? Where you tend to see lower parts of the commodity chain in the periphery and higher parts tend to be in the core, right? The finished products. All right, so here's a good example of a commodity chain. We see the farmer, right? When we start off maybe with research, right, with new varieties of whatever we're making, and we see maybe chemical fertilizers, something along those lines. So those are there as well, right? The farmer sells to either the cooperative or the exporter, right, which then gets transported. Also part of the commodity chain transportation systems, something that we don't always think about, right? The exporter then to the transports to the importer, which then goes to the retailer, which then goes to the customer, right? Sometimes there's a manufacturing process where this whatever we're making here gets turned into something else, right? So the wheat gets turned into flour, maybe something along those lines. It gets sold to a wholesaler, perhaps. All sorts of different things in a commodity chain, right? So this is a fairly simple commodity chain. They can be very complex if we're talking about a complex piece of technology or machinery that has many different parts. All right, all the way from stocking the shelves. That would be the end of the commodity chain. All right, last thing we got to talk about here, or one of the last things we got to talk about, is the economies of scale. Economies of scale basically talks about the cost advantage, right, that big places, enterprises, right, obtain due to size, output, and scale of operation, right? Which drives down the cost per unit, right, of output, generally decreasing with an increased scale as fixed costs are spread out over more units of an output. So think about it. That's a fairly bulky way to look at it, right? But you are more efficient. Think if you're making chocolate chip cookies, right? And you make one chocolate chip cookie, not a batch, just one, right? You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do all of those things, you have to heat the oven, all of the things that go into that, right? So if you've ever heard the expression in for a penny, in for a pound, right? You may as well make a double batch of cookies, okay, because you're already doing all of that work, right? So if you go big, right, and you do that, it's going to be a lot easier to make all of those together at once, right? And it's much more efficient than it would be to make one simple chocolate chip cookie, even if you just want one simple chocolate chip cookie, right? Generally, it comes in a batch, right? In my house, it's mashed potatoes. I don't make a small amount of mashed potatoes. I'm going to go big. If I'm going to take the time to do all of that work to make mashed potatoes, I'm going to make 3 pounds, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, right, of mashed potatoes. Same works, right? With when you think about the amount of money, right? If you're producing 10,000 hammers to sell to Walmart, right? You're going to get a better deal, right? And Walmart will demand that you buy. That they when they buy from somebody, they're going to buy huge amounts, right? And by doing that, they get a better deal on it, right? So the amount of the amount of cost per unit, you know, it really matters if you're making one as opposed to making 10,000. Right. So again, when we look at that, the fixed cost per unit, the fixed costs are there, right? The costs of heating the oven, for example, is a fixed cost if you're making cookies, right? You have to heat the oven no matter what, right? So you may as well heat it, just a little longer, and create multiple batches of cookies. All right. So that leads us to the new international division of labor, also known as outsourcing, right? And that basically means that low skilled work is going to move to LDCs. We call it outsourcing. We have something called the Fordist approach, which is a repetitive task, easily replaceable. Think about Henry Ford and when he made the Model T on that assembly line, he paid people $5 a day, which was a huge wage back in the day. Um, but he expected a lot you to work this mundane job where you did the same thing. You screwed on one screw and then the assembly line would move and you'd screw on the same screw to the next one and it would move on and move on and move on, right? Um, that makes workers easily replaceable, right? That you don't need a lot of training, that you're not willing to do that. It's mundane, right? They don't ask you a lot of input, right? What would make your job easier? You're just a cog in the wheel, right? When we look at MDCs, right? And we look at the post-Fortis approach, that's a little different. High-skilled factory jobs are going to stay in MDCs. You see a lot of educated workforce in MDCs. And so if you have a industry that needs high-skilled people, right, it's going to stay in an MDC. It's not necessarily going to move overseas because not everybody can do it. Not everybody, you can't pay people $2 an hour to do it, right? You need people who have degrees and have advanced skills. They need to get paid a lot of money. They're generally coming from an MDC, and with this you get something called the post-Fortis approach, right? And that's where skilled workers are asked, right, to solve problems. They're asked to work in teams. They're going to receive fair treatment as well. So note the difference, right, between low skilled, where low skilled work goes is going to go to LDCs. High skilled work is going to stay in MDCs, right? And then you're going to see more of a Fordist approach, right, in low skilled factory jobs and a post Fordist approach in high skilled factory jobs. All right, last thing we're going to talk about, vertical integration. I said last thing numerous times, right? We'll actually see if this is the last thing. No, we are not close to the last thing. Okay, so we will move quickly through this, right? Vertical integration, right? It's where owners own every part. The company owns all parts of the commodity chain. This is a kind of a Fordist approach. Henry Ford wanted to own everything, right, from the raw materials. He wanted to own the iron ore mines. He wanted to own the coal mines. He wanted to own the factories, all the power sources that went into the factories, all the trucks and boats that went into that, right? That doesn't necessarily exist. It's not used as much, right? Because transportation costs, it's really easier to outsource some of these jobs, right? So vertical integration is the owning multiple parts of the commodity chain, but much of that has been more. It's more efficient to outsource that stuff these days. All right, so there's the American car, right? And we look at the percentage of U.S. made parts, right? The Chevy Malibu has the percentage of assembly, right? And the percentage of parts, that's going to be mostly an American-made car, whereas a Toyota Prius is made in 20% assembly there, right? And you also have percentage of US made parts, right? But the Honda Civic is more of an American car, right, than the Ford Fusion, which is kind of interesting. Right. Spatial fix again talks about the idea of a spatial fix, movement of production from one site to another based on place-based advantages. So things shifting based if labor gets cheaper somewhere, if a new resource pops up somewhere, right? That production will shift from place to place, and it's not quite as fixed as it used to be, right? Just in time delivery, good example of that. Outsourcing is going to be a good example of that as well, right? Flexible production systems are another kind of an example of post-Fordist productivity, right? Where we look at moving and changing and diversifying the product and customizing a product that will help um, suppliers, right? It will help customers choose what they want, and it makes it very flexible, right? In its design. So manufacturers can choose suppliers based on the equation. They can change them as demand changes. They can do all sorts of different things, right? And again, this is post Forex productivity where you don't have the vertical integration. You can move around. You can shift dealers and outsourcers as you need. All right, so looking at industrial growth, we see MDCs declining. We see the BRICS countries, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's where most of the future growth is expected. We see this in East Asia as well, right? And South Asia, we're seeing an increase as well. And also Latin America, Brazil, coastal Brazil is a good example. And then Mexico, right? And Mexico has a very specific term called maquiladora, right? And this is a very interesting site and where site and situation come together, right? Factories near the U.S. border, you get the you get the site advantage of cheap labor in Mexico, right? Where they don't pay they don't pay as much in Mexico as they do in the United States, but you are very, very close to the U.S. market, so you still have that advantage of cheaper transportation costs because of proximity to where you're selling that stuff. All right. So again, we look at expected growth as we move through here, and we see China again going way up. We see the United States still continuing to move because remember, we do produce a lot of goods. We just don't necessarily have as many jobs in industry anymore, right? India moving up, right, and we see some of these other ones right on the grow as well. Right, so there's a Sony factory in Mexico, good example of a maquiladora. You see this along Tijuana in the U.S. and other cities on the U.S.-Mexico border. Right, and again, we look at U.S. Mexican automobile trade, right, happening as well. And in terms of Mexico to U.S., we see the number of dollars going up, right, where we don't see as much U.S. going, U.S. money going into Mexico. All right. Again, we still see textiles. We're going to quickly talk about that. And just in terms of labor-intensive industry, spinning of fibers, right? All of that. All of these are labor-intensive, and they take place in India and China. All right. We tend to see as we move up the production of the commodity chain, we do see MDCs are more example to see cutting and sewing just because it's a little bit more skilled and a little bit closer to the markets, but not a whole lot, right, compared to what it used to be. So there's cotton spinning. Again, you see that connection between China and India. All right, here's cotton weaving. Again, you see that connection between China and India, right? And then you see assembly happening, right, in India as well. So a lot of this is taking place, right? Labor-intensive industries going to take place in LDCs because you don't pay workers very much there, right? So again, we look at our international textile train, right, and we look at textile clothing, right, coming, and we see where it's coming from. East Asia and Southeast Asia is where the bulk of where our clothes come from. All right, and the last thing to look at here is a fascinating chart, which has a hoodie, right? It has two different hoodies, and the cost of the total cost, right? If you were to make your hoodie in the U.S., your sweatshirt, it would cost $38.10 to make that hoodie, right? In Asia, it would cost $31. All right, so almost $7 difference here. $31.40. So $6.70 difference, right? If we look at the costs here that are associated, it actually costs more to spin and weave in in Asia, right? The trim is a little cheaper, right? So these two are about the same wash. It's about $20 each, right? The difference here is this blue, right? Where in the United States it would cost $17 for labor, where it costs only $5.50. So you save $10 right there, right? Note that you do have to pay import taxes, duty taxes, tariffs, if you will, in a 350. But if you add 350 and 550 for labor, that's $9, right? And that is not $17. So that's where that savings comes from. Shipping is going to cost a little more, but remember, it only costs $1.20 more because of containerization and the cheap transportation cost that exists in 2020. So that leads to a much cheaper product, right? And that's a significant difference, right, in money, and it means that you can charge people a lot less, and so or you make more money, right, or a combination of both. All right. Last things, a couple things we got to talk about is where industry has changed in developed regions. In the United States, we've seen a shift from the Northeast to the South and to the West. Right. Historically, we look at the Civil War being poor and without infrastructure, so industry wasn't there because it lacked infrastructure, it lacked roads, it lacked proper electricity, all of those things. That has changed, right? And that is no longer a thing, right? And so modernization is going to attract new industry, and with this comes legislation, and this is where we start talking about labor unions. All right. And full disclosure, I am a member of a labor union. I belong to the Teacher Labor Union. So just so you know, that's where I'm coming from, right? And take that into consideration. Um, right to work laws, right, are a law that says you don't have to join a union. You're not required to join a union. And a union generally tends to be a group of workers, right, that band together and they collectively bargain, right? They ask that your wages are based on everybody, right? That you pay everybody the same, and you don't negotiate for a raise or medical benefits or time off or things like that. As an individual, but you do it as a union. You collectively bargain. So it's a school of fish as opposed to a single fish, right? It's power in numbers. And if you don't have people, everybody joining a union, if you're not required to join a union, then your unions just aren't as strong. Right. And so union powers are limited in states that have right to work laws. And those tend to be located in the South. Right. And so if you are a factory owner, and you're looking to open a factory or move a factory, you might want to move to the South or the West because you don't have to deal with unions, and are going to make wages generally a little higher. All right, so that's one way. All right, one place. In Europe, we see a shift from the northwest to the south and the east, right? And that the European Union has a heavy, heavy hand in that, right? And it's spreading out their development from richer EU countries to poorer EU countries. So we see this in places like Spain, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. Those are places where factories are being shifted to, right? They're being shifted away from other spots. You get cheaper labor there. But you still get skilled workers and you're still close to markets. So that's the EU shift, right? The United States shifting from the northeast to the south and the west. The EU is shifting from the northwest to the south and east. All right, so there's right to work laws in 1950. You didn't see a whole lot of those, right? Note the diamond is a right to work place. We saw this in the Dakotas, right? And then we saw it in the South. By 2017, note that the rise of right to work laws, right? But you will see in the industrial North that you see there's less of that as well. And Minnesota is not a right to work state. It is a union state. All right, right to work states in 2018. So there you have it, right? And then we also look then at uh, the amount of wages, right? And we see a lower wage in the South, where right to work states are very much stronger, right? It's not a complete correlation, but there is something to be said for that. There's your shifts in Europe, right? Where you see closing in places like France, and you see opening in places like Poland and Spain. And that is it. Hopefully things are going well for you. Hopefully you do well on the quiz and well on the test. Bye bye.